In 2008, the world watched a spectacle in Beijing. An opening ceremony so precise, so massive, it felt like a message. Not just welcome to the Olympics, but welcome to a new era. Thousands of performers moving as one, fireworks lighting up the sky, a statement of power, control, and arrival. A century earlier, the idea would have sounded like a fantasy, because not long ago, China wasn't hosting the world. It was being carved up by it. So here's the mystery. How does a country go from invasion and humiliation to reshaping global manufacturing, global trade, maybe even global power itself? In the early 1800s, China saw itself as the center of the civilized world. And in many ways, technology, culture, trade, it had been. But Europe was changing fast. Industrial power meant faster ships, bigger cannons, and economies hungry for profit. Britain especially couldn't get enough Chinese tea, millions of pounds of it every year. But there was a problem. China didn't want what Britain was selling. China wanted silver, hard currency. That created a trade imbalance Britain despised. And so Britain found a solution, one that would poison the relationship for generations. They began smuggling opium into China. Grown in British-controlled India, sold illegally through coastal networks. At first, it spread quietly. Then it spread everywhere. Addiction hollowed out communities. Productivity collapsed. Soldiers weakened. Silver began flowing out of China instead of in. When China's government tried to stop it, confiscating and destroying massive stockpiles of opium, Britain's response wasn't negotiation. It was war. The First Opium War exposed something terrifying. China had numbers, but Britain had industrial firepower. Steamships, modern cannons, rifles that reloaded in seconds. China's forces relied on weapons and tactics that had worked for centuries, but not against an industrial empire. And when China lost, the punishment wasn't just military. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanking demanded 21 million ounces of silver, forced open key ports to British trade, and handed over something that would scar the national memory forever: Hong Kong. But here's what Britain didn't see coming. This humiliation would create something far more dangerous than an army. It would create a national obsession. A second Opium War followed. This time, Britain and France. In 1860, foreign forces marched to Beijing and looted the old summer palace. An irreplaceable treasury of art, books, and treasures. Then burned it to ash. China was forced into more concessions, more ports, foreign diplomats in Beijing, legalization of the opium trade itself. It wasn't just defeat. It was a public dismantling of everything China believed about itself. And once China was pried open, everyone rushed in. Russia took land in the north. Germany claimed territory in Shandong. Japan looked across the sea and saw weakness. China wasn't colonized outright like parts of Africa or India. Instead, it was carved into spheres of influence. Foreign-controlled ports, railways, mines, with foreign courts and foreign rules. Chinese citizens in their own homeland were sometimes treated as second class. The message was brutal. China wasn't in control of China anymore. By 1900, rage boiled over. A movement known as the Boxers rose up, targeting foreign influence and Chinese Christians. The Boxers believed they were immune to bullets. They weren't. But what happened next made them look prophetic. Because foreign powers proved they could occupy Beijing itself. An alliance of 8 foreign nations invaded, crushed the uprising, and forced China to pay 450 million taels of silver, a sum that dwarfed the government's entire revenue. It wasn't only a military defeat. It was a psychological breaking point. The public saw what the state couldn't do. It couldn't protect China. In 1911, revolution toppled the Qing dynasty. China became a republic, but it didn't become stable. Warlords fractured the country. Regions became personal kingdoms. The central government barely functioned. And then came the catastrophe that still shapes China's national story. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners were killed over weeks, alongside widespread violence and destruction. Cities bombed, villages burned, communities shattered. China fought for 8 years, poorly equipped, fractured, suffering unimaginable losses. But something else was forming in that fire, a new sense of unity. Because when pain is shared across an entire country, it forges a powerful identity. We were hurt together, and we will never be hurt like this again. When World War II ended, Japan was defeated. But China wasn't suddenly healed. Civil war resumed between nationalists and communists. By 1949, the communists won. The nationalist leadership retreated to Taiwan, and in Beijing, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. China was exhausted, poor, scarred. But for many, the meaning was bigger than economics. China was unified again, and from that point forward, the memory of humiliation, 1839 to 1949, would become more than history. It became a warning, a lesson, a weapon. The message repeated across generations. If China is weak, it will be exploited. So China must become strong. But strength didn't arrive overnight. Between 1949 and 1976, China tried to rebuild through radical campaigns. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. The costs were catastrophic. Mass starvation, political chaos. Tens of millions died. But even those disasters reinforced the lesson. Weakness kills. And by 1978, China was ready to try something completely different. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping took control. He wasn't a romantic revolutionary like Mao. He was a pragmatist. He believed the Communist Party must stay in charge. But he also believed China needed radical economic reform. He promoted the 4 modernizations: agriculture, industry, defense, and science. At first, the mood felt loosened. In Beijing, posters appeared debating the past, criticizing leaders. a wave of political expression called the democracy wall. One voice went further. Wei Jingxing, who argued for a fifth modernization, democracy itself. That crossed a line. He was imprisoned. The pattern was set. Economic experimentation would expand. Political control would remain absolute. Then Deng introduced a phrase that became a blueprint. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. For the first time, market mechanisms would be allowed inside a communist system, carefully, under state supervision. The boldest experiments happened in special economic zones, places designed to attract foreign investment with lower taxes and fewer restrictions. The most famous? Shenzhen, just miles from Hong Kong. In 1980, Shenzhen was a fishing village of 30,000 people. Today, it's a megacity of over 12 million. The tech capital of China, home to companies like Huawei and Tencent. That transformation happened in one generation. The reforms weren't only urban. In the countryside, collectivized farming was rolled back. Households gained control over land and production. Agricultural output surged by more than 60% in just a few years. Famine, which had haunted rural life for centuries, became far less common. University entrance exams returned. Students sent to the countryside were allowed to come back. China was rebooting its future. Abroad, China moved carefully but confidently, improving ties with the West, hosting foreign leaders, softening language around Taiwan. But China also showed it would use force when necessary, launching a brief, costly war with Vietnam in 1979 that exposed military weaknesses and accelerated modernization. This was the new China, pragmatic, strategic, focused on one mission: development. But for many, economic reform raised a dangerous hope. If the country modernizes economically, won't politics modernize too? A reform-minded leader, Hu Yaobang, became a symbol of openness. When student protests spread, he refused to crush them. Hardliners forced him to resign. He was publicly humiliated. In 1989, he died. His death triggered mourning that exploded into something no one expected. Students flooded Tiananmen Square, demanding freedom of speech, reform, accountability. Hunger strikes, international cameras. For weeks, the world watched. The leadership split. Some wanted dialogue. Hardliners wanted control. Martial law was declared. Then, on June 3rd, the tanks moved in. What happened next shocked the world. The exact death toll remains disputed. Official figures said hundreds. Witnesses reported far more. But one image defined it all. A single man, shopping bags in hand, standing before a column of tanks. That clip played on every Western television. China was isolated, sanctioned, investment dried up. The reforms looked dead. And then Deng did something nobody expected. In 1992, elderly but determined, Deng toured the booming southern zones and demanded growth continue. Faster, bolder. It worked. It helped forge an unspoken deal that would define the next generation. Stability and prosperity in exchange for political obedience. China embraced a, quote, socialist market economy. Prices followed markets, not state commands. State-owned enterprises were restructured, privatized, or allowed to fail. Growth exploded. GDP growth jumped from around 4% to over 14% and stayed high for years. The World Bank called it one of the fastest sustained expansions by a major economy in history. In 1990, hundreds of millions lived in extreme poverty. Within 3 decades, that figure fell to near zero under international standards. It became the most rapid poverty reduction in modern history. But growth had costs. Social welfare systems weakened. Unemployment rose. Corruption spread. Pollution choked cities. Inequality widened, especially between urban and rural areas. Tens of millions moved from villages into booming cities. But many were blocked from benefits by the hukou system, living like second-class citizens in the places they built. And still, China kept moving. In 1997, Deng died. His successors pushed forward. Economic reform, political control. That same year, Hong Kong returned to China. 2 years later, Macau. These were framed as symbolically closing the century of humiliation. The West predicted that a growing middle class would demand Western-style democracy. China's trajectory defied that expectation. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. Exports surged. Global companies offshored manufacturing to China for scale and cost. China became the workshop of the world. Economic growth hit rates that seemed impossible. 10%, 12%, even higher in peak years. By 2008, China hosted the Olympics. By 2009, China overtook Japan to become the world's second-largest economy. In one lifetime, from the ashes of war to the factory of the world. Today, China is the world's second-largest economy. It manufactures everything from smartphones to solar panels. It's building infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and beyond. China's rise is no longer just a story about factories. It's a story about power. And where there is power, there is friction, especially with the only country above China in the rankings. In Part 2, we'll follow that friction: trade, technology, supply chains, and the rules of the 21st century. Because interdependence creates leverage, and leverage invites conflict. If Part 1 explained the rise, Part 2 explains the clash. Subscribe and meet me there.